This is not a story. This is a warning. Across America, there are places where the nightmares never end, and the truth is buried with the dead. Tonight, we open another door. Welcome to the American Nightmare. Zug Island sits where it has always sat, low, industrial, and largely unseen. A man-made island pressed between river channels, stitched together from slag, steel ambition, and the belief that if something was loud enough and dangerous enough, it could be controlled. For more than a century, it was not a place one visited. It was a place one worked. Furnaces burned day and night. Conveyors screamed. Towers exhaled smoke that never quite drifted away. The ground itself seemed to vibrate, as if the island were permanently bracing for impact. Access was restricted. Roads were limited. Security was routine, but secrecy was cultural. Most Detroiters knew Zug Island only as a shape on a map, something to be driven past, not toward. There were stories, of course. There always are. People spoke of the noise, how it followed workers home, ringing in the ears long after shifts ended, of lights that never shut off, of the orange glare on low clouds like a distant fire that refused to go out. But stories are not evidence, and nothing criminal was ever confirmed on Zug Island. What follows was not known then. It was assembled later, in fragments, after fear had already found a name. In the late years of the 20th century, Zug Island was mentioned only in passing, in employment rosters, in shipping logs, in the gray talk of break rooms where men learned to speak over machinery, and the company learned to speak around everything else. The first incident did not happen on the island itself. A man, referred to here as Worker 1, worked the industrial corridor that fed and framed the island. His job put him near it, at gates along service roads, beside the river where barges moved like slow animals. He was known to co-workers as reliable, quiet, someone who did not linger after shifts ended, as if the place charged rent for every extra minute. He carried his lunch in the same dented tin pail. He kept a small flashlight clipped to his belt, even in daylight, just in case. He made a point of crossing the bridge before the sky went fully dark, because, so he said, nights changed the shape of things out there. Then he missed a shift. At first it registered as inconvenience, not alarm. In that work, men ran late. Men slept through alarms. Men quit without notice. Days passed. A supervisor made a note. A co-worker shrugged. The machinery did not. Weeks later, Worker 1 was found deceased across the bridge that connected the island to the mainland. Public records did not specify a cause of death. No details were released. No suspicion was announced. Authorities treated it as an isolated fatality, another statistic in a place already fluent in loss. Zug Island was not emphasized. It did not need to be. A man died near a hard place. That was all. Some said he'd fallen. Some said he'd been hit. Some said he'd been foolish with alcohol or exhaustion, two common currencies in that line of work. No one could prove anything, and no one officially tried to. Not long after, a second name surfaced only briefly: Worker 2. He failed to return to work. No press conference followed. No public missing person campaign emerged. He lived in a residential pocket of southwest Detroit, a neighborhood of narrow streets, chain-link fences, and back porches where families knew one another's cars by sound. On paper, he was ordinary. Steady paycheck, modest house, a routine so dependable it became invisible. Then the routine broke. A friend reported him not answering. A foreman marked him no call. A landlord mentioned that the mail piled up. But the city had so many silences that one more barely stirred the air. Again, there was no public explanation, no official link, no warning. The two men were not connected, not by investigators, not by newspapers, not by the people who still believed at that point that danger came with a siren. At the time, these incidents were treated as unrelated, and that is an important detail. Because fear, when it arrives, likes to claim it has always been there. In truth, it begins quietly, like a draft under a door you haven't sealed in years. Zug Island remained what it had always been: loud, dangerous, and indifferent. Only later, after other names, other streets, other nights, would people begin to look backward and notice how often the island appeared at the edges of memory. Not as a crime scene, not as an origin, only as a presence. At the time, there was nothing to investigate, nothing to connect, nothing anyone would admit to fear. And perhaps that is how the story truly begins. Not with a scream, but with the decision to keep driving. Southwest Detroit has never pretended to be untouched by danger. It is a place built around work, factories, freight lines, late shifts, early mornings. People here understand risk. They understand noise in the night, raised voices, sirens that pass without stopping. What they were not prepared for was something quieter. At first, the nights remained familiar. Porch lights hummed. Televisions glowed behind drawn curtains. The same streets emptied and refilled according to habit. Nothing looked different. That is what people would say later. Nothing looked different. The first body, referred to here as Murder 1, was discovered in the early hours after the neighborhood had already begun to wake. There were no witnesses, no calls reporting screams or disturbances, just the sudden presence of police tape where there had been none the night before. The location unsettled people more than the fact of the death itself. It was not hidden, not abandoned. It was a residential stretch, bordered by houses close enough together that windows faced one another like unblinking eyes. A place where someone could be watched without being seen. Authorities released little information. They did not describe injuries. They did not speculate. They did not say the word homicide immediately. Within days, the street resumed its routines. Cars returned. Children walked past the spot without being told what had happened there. Adults spoke in lowered voices, careful not to shape fear too clearly. Then came Murder 2, discovered in a different part of southwest Detroit, but close enough that residents noticed the distance without measuring it. Again, there were no reports of a struggle, no neighbors claiming to have heard anything unusual. The person had simply failed to arrive where they were expected to be, and was later found. This time, people began comparing details that were not officially released. The hour, the quiet, the absence of witnesses. 2 deaths could still be coincidence, but coincidence does not usually repeat itself so precisely. Police statements remained restrained. The incidents were described as separate investigations. The public was advised to remain aware of their surroundings, a phrase that implied movement without explaining from what or whom. By the time Murder 3 was discovered, the neighborhoods had already changed. People began to report things that were difficult to categorize. A man walking home after midnight felt footsteps match his pace for nearly a full block, only to stop when he turned suddenly, finding the sidewalk empty. A woman described the sensation of being watched from behind parked cars, though she never saw anyone when she looked. Someone else said they heard breathing close enough to feel, but when they spun around, there was no one there. None of these reports were logged as crimes. They were too uncertain, too subjective. Still, they circulated. The third discovery confirmed what many already felt but had not said aloud. Whatever was happening was not random. Again, there was no public declaration of a pattern, no confirmation of a single offender. But patrols increased. Officers lingered longer at corners. Flashlights swept alleys that had never required them before. The name emerged during this period, quietly and without ceremony. The Southwest Ripper. It was never officially adopted. It appeared first in conversation, spoken half as a warning, half as a test, to see how the other person would react. The name gave shape to a fear that had been moving without one. With the name came a shift in behavior. People stopped taking shortcuts through alleys they had used for years. Bus stops emptied earlier. Lights stayed on in houses long after sleep should have come. Some residents reported being followed, always briefly, always without confrontation. The sense was not of pursuit, but of proximity, as if someone were close enough to reach out, yet choosing not to. The violence itself remained unseen. What lingered was the feeling that it did not need to be witnessed to be deliberate. As the fear grew, earlier incidents resurfaced in conversation. Someone mentioned the industrial bridge. Someone else mentioned Zug Island, not as a suspect location, but as a place where people learned to disappear into noise and machinery. The worker deaths, once dismissed as unrelated, were spoken of again, this time with hesitation. Officially, there was still no connection, no acknowledgement that the past had anything to do with the present. But the idea had taken hold. By the end of that year, Southwest Detroit had not erupted into panic. There were no mass departures, no curfews, no headlines that declared a city under siege. Instead, the change was subtle. People walked faster. They checked shadows. They listened for footsteps that did not belong to them. And somewhere between the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood, trains, traffic, televisions through thin walls, another sound seemed to exist. Not loud enough to identify, not clear enough to report, just close enough to suggest that whatever was responsible was still there. By the time the neighborhood understood it was not dealing with isolated deaths, it was already too late to remember when the fear began. It had seeped in quietly, like damp through basement walls, unnoticed until everything carried the smell of it. The official language stayed careful. Investigations were ongoing. Residents were encouraged to remain vigilant. But on the streets of Southwest Detroit, vigilance took on a different shape. People stopped walking alone at night, not as a rule, but as a reflex. And when they did walk, when they had to, keys sat between their fingers like teeth. Heads stayed forward, ears did most of the looking. Because what residents began reporting wasn't simply violence, it was presence. One survivor, referred to here as Witness 1, described the first sign as a change in the air behind her. Not a sound, not a footstep. A sensation, like someone stepping into the same room without turning on a light. She was coming back from a late shift, following a route she'd taken for years. Half a block from her door, she heard a shoe scrape pavement. Once, then nothing. When she turned, she saw a figure near the mouth of an alley, not running, not rushing, standing as if he had been there the whole time. She couldn't describe a face. She couldn't describe eyes. What she remembered was posture, straight, patient, and the way he seemed too calm for someone caught in the open. She said he wore dark clothing that did not catch the streetlight, as if the light didn't want to touch him. She walked faster. The scrape came again, then again, matching her pace. When she ran, he did not sprint after her. He simply remained close enough that she could feel him behind her, a measured distance, like someone who knew exactly how far was far enough. She made it inside, slammed the door, locked it, and stood in the dark listening. No pounding, no shouting, just the faint sound of breathing on the other side of the wood, so close it could have been her own. Another account, Witness 2, came from a man who had been stopping at the same corner store for years. He noticed a vehicle behind him for 3 turns, then 4. No headlights flashing, no horn, no attempt to pass, just a steady, patient tail that never broke. He pulled into his driveway and sat with the engine running. He expected the vehicle to continue on. It didn't. It rolled past slowly and stopped at the curb half a house away. The driver remained inside for a long time. Witness 2 watched the silhouette through his windshield. He said the head inside the car didn't turn, didn't look around, just faced forward, as if waiting for something to happen, as if time was not a problem. When the vehicle finally moved, it didn't speed off. It simply drifted away like it had all the hours in the world. A third account, Witness 3, was the closest to a description of the suspected Ripper that anyone ever offered. She had been inside her home when she noticed someone standing near her back gate, partially obscured by a fence post. She didn't scream. She didn't call out. She watched, frozen, because the figure wasn't acting like a trespasser. Trespassers hurry. Trespassers flinch. This figure stood still, one hand resting on the top rail of the gate as if testing its weight. She said he seemed tall, maybe not unusually, but tall enough to feel wrong in that posture. Broad shoulders, a deliberate stillness, like a man waiting for a train. When he finally moved, he didn't climb the gate. He didn't force it. He simply walked away, slowly, turning his head once, just enough for her to see that the face was either shadowed or obscured by something she couldn't clearly identify. Then he was gone. These accounts were fragmented, inconsistent, told later, sometimes with shaking hands, sometimes with forced laughter meant to make the memory smaller. But they shared a common detail that made the skin tighten. The suspected Ripper did not behave like someone afraid of being seen. He behaved like someone who expected to be forgotten. As the stalking reports spread, so did the quiet changes. Businesses began closing earlier without saying why. Families kept children inside, even in summer. People moved away for work or for family and did not return. And then the violence escalated. Additional bodies were discovered in the same broad area, again after the fact, again with limited public details. The official voice stayed restrained, as if the truth could be softened by refusing to say it plainly. No dramatic confession, no public arrest, no moment where the city could exhale. Instead, the neighborhood learned to live with a question that had teeth. Who walks these streets when the lights go out? Who stands in alleys without moving? Who waits in cars without turning their head? And inevitably, the older associations returned. Zug Island, the bridge, the worker deaths. Not as proof, not as accusation, only as a shadow cast backward, giving the past a shape it hadn't had at the time. Officially, there was never a confirmed origin, only rumor and retrospective dread. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the story stopped being discussed. Not because it was solved, not because it was disproven, because the public moved on the way it always does, toward newer fears, fresher headlines, louder tragedies. But places do not move on. Zug Island still hums in the distance, indifferent. The streets of southwest Detroit still hold their familiar corners and quiet alleys. And some nights, residents still listen for footsteps that match their pace, not because they have evidence, but because once you felt a presence that close, you never entirely stop believing it could return. Thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you found our report informative. Join us again next week. Same time, same place. We'll be traveling south to an area where the rules of communication are different. Those rules are to be obeyed. Messages will not arrive. Any warning will come too late. And silence is often the only response. What happened there was never fully explained. It wasn't corrected. It was simply accepted. Only on American Nightmare.